Marcus Way had exactly 3 hours to prepare for the most important diplomatic event of his career, which was unfortunate because, until 3 hours ago, he didn't have a diplomatic career. "Just stand quietly," Ambassador Carrington had rasped from his medical bed, his face an alarming shade of purple that the doctors insisted was temporary but looked decidedly permanent. "Observe protocol. Don't speak unless directly addressed. And for the love of all that's holy, don't cause an interstellar incident. Sir, I'm a logistics officer. I coordinate supply chains. I've never done anything remotely diplomatic." "But you've negotiated, haven't you?" "I negotiated extra rations for my battalion during the Kepler supply shortage. That's not the same as representing humanity before an empress who's been ruling since before my great-grandparents were born." Carrington had waved one swollen hand dismissively. "Same principles. Resources, compromise, mutual benefit. You'll be fine, probably." The "probably" was not reassuring. Now Marcus stood in a corridor outside the throne chamber of Empress Sarin of the Caliph Empire, wearing formal diplomatic attire that fit reasonably well because he and Carrington were approximately the same size, holding a data tablet full of protocols he tried to memorize and mostly failed to retain. The Caliph Empire was ancient in a way that made human civilization look like an enthusiastic toddler. While humans were still figuring out which end of the spear went into the mammoth, the Caliph were building stellar civilizations and writing philosophical treatises on the nature of consciousness across dimensional boundaries. Empress Sarin herself had been ruling for 300 years, which was apparently quite normal for Caliph if you avoided assassination or accident. She'd seen empires rise and fall, watched species make first contact and first war, presided over a territory that spanned 14 systems and touched the borders of half a dozen other major powers. And Marcus, whose greatest achievement was optimizing shipping routes to reduce costs by 7%, was about to represent humanity in her throne room. "This is fine," he muttered to himself. "This is totally fine. Nothing can possibly go wrong." His neural implant pinged, a notification he didn't recognize, some kind of low-level alert that flashed once and disappeared before he could read it. Probably a glitch. The implant had been acting weird since they'd arrived in the Caliph system, throwing occasional errors that the tech team said were just interference from local stellar radiation. Marcus pulled up the brief on his tablet for the 15th time, trying to commit the important parts to memory. The ceremony was purely formal. The Caliph were renewing trade agreements with multiple species, and human presence was expected but not crucial. There would be approximately 200 delegates present. Marcus's job was to stand in his assigned position, marked on the floor with a symbol he'd been shown how to recognize. Maintain appropriate posture, straight but not rigid, attentive but not aggressive, and generally be present without being noticed. Simple, straightforward. He could do this. The strange feeling in his chest suggested otherwise. It had started maybe 20 minutes ago, a sensation that wasn't quite anxiety, though there was plenty of that too. More like significance without cause, recognition without object. Like his body was preparing for something important that his brain hadn't been informed about. Marcus took a deep breath, rolled his shoulders, and tried to project confidence he absolutely did not feel. The massive doors before him were carved from something that looked like obsidian, but shifted colors when the light hit it just right, cycling through blacks and deep purples and occasionally flashing silver. Caliph aesthetic design, his briefing materials had explained, valued complexity and transformation. Static beauty was considered inferior to beauty that evolved. The doors began to open, moving with perfect silence despite their obvious mass. This was it. No turning back. Time to represent humanity by standing very still and not screwing up. Marcus stepped forward into the throne chamber and the world tilted sideways. Not literally. The floor remained solid beneath his feet. But something fundamental shifted, like reality had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal that it had been operating under different rules than he'd assumed. The feeling in his chest intensified from vague significance to absolute certainty. He was exactly where he needed to be. He had no idea why. The throne chamber was designed to overwhelm, and it succeeded. The space was vast and vertical, stretching upward into shadows that the ambient light couldn't quite penetrate. Columns rose from the floor like crystallized time, not smooth, but layered and complex, as if each century of the empire's existence had added another stratum to their structure. Light came from everywhere and nowhere, filtering through angles that Marcus's human brain insisted were impossible, but his eyes confirmed were real. The effect was disorienting, beautiful, and clearly intentional. The throne itself sat at the far end, elevated on a dais that required climbing exactly 47 steps. Marcus counted them automatically as he walked, a logistics habit he couldn't break even when it served no purpose. Other delegates were already in position, arranged in a careful semicircle before the dais. Marcus recognized a few species from his briefings, the Valorian contingent with their metallic skin that shifted through colors based on emotion, currently showing neutral bronze. The Crithian warlord who looked like someone had convinced a storm cloud to hold a vaguely humanoid shape. Representatives from the coalition of Outer Rim worlds, from the Nethran sovereignty, from powers Marcus couldn't identify on sight. All of them positioned according to protocol that determined status through age of alliance, length of relationship, strategic importance. Humans were last, newest, least significant in a gathering of civilizations that counted their histories in millennia. Marcus's assigned position was marked with a symbol that looked like 3 overlapping circles, the Terran Alliance designation in Calith formal notation. He walked toward it, measuring his pace to match what the briefing had described as purposeful but not rushed, respectful but not fearful. He was probably getting it wrong. Everything felt wrong, actually, except for that strange certainty in his chest that insisted everything was exactly right. The other delegates were watching him with varying degrees of interest. The newest addition to formal proceedings always drew attention, apparently. Marcus tried to ignore the stares and focus on reaching his mark without tripping over his own feet. He arrived, turned to face the throne, and for the first time got a clear look at Empress Sarin. The images he'd seen in briefing materials hadn't prepared him. She was tall, even-seated, easily 2 meters, maybe more. Her robes appeared to be constructed from light that someone had convinced to hold a shape, flowing and shifting through colors that didn't quite map to human visual spectrum. Her skin had a luminous quality, like she was lit from within. Her ears, the distinctive Calith feature, swept back from her head in elegant curves, currently held in a position Marcus's cultural database couldn't interpret. But it was her eyes that caught him. Large, spiral-patterned, swirling like living galaxies, they swept across the assembled delegates with the kind of assessment that came from 3 centuries of reading beings and situations. And when those eyes met Marcus's, everything stopped. The Empress went absolutely still, not the controlled stillness of royalty maintaining composure during formal ceremony. This was the frozen shock of someone seeing something that shouldn't exist, can't exist, but undeniably does. Her breath caught. Marcus could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way her chest hitched mid-inhalation. The color drained from her face, her luminous complexion going pale enough that several delegates noticed and shifted uncomfortably. Her ears flattened against her head so fast it looked like a flinch, an involuntary reaction that her 300 years of royal training couldn't prevent. Then she shuddered. It was a full-body tremor that lasted maybe 2 seconds, her entire frame shaking like someone had run an electrical current through her. Her hands gripped the armrests of her throne hard enough that Marcus could see the tension from 47 steps away, hard enough that the material, whatever it was, actually creaked softly in the silent chamber. The silence was profound. 200 beings holding their breath, watching their empress react to something with visible shock for the first time in living memory. Marcus stood frozen in his assigned spot, his brain cycling through increasingly panicked possibilities. Did I violate protocol? Is there something wrong with how I'm standing? Do I have something offensive on my uniform? Is eye contact forbidden? Did I accidentally insult her somehow? Is this a cultural thing I don't understand? The Empress's personal guard had shifted to high alert. 8 Caliph warriors in armor that looked ceremonial but absolutely wasn't. Their hands moving toward weapons that probably didn't look like weapons but definitely were. Her advisors were leaning toward each other, whispering urgently in Caliph too rapid and too quiet for Marcus's translator implant to catch. Whatever language they were using, it was formal, archaic, probably reserved for crisis situations. And through it all, Empress Saren continued to stare at Marcus like he was a ghost made flesh, like he was something impossible given form, and standing in her throne room in direct violation of reality's rules. Marcus wanted to look away, desperately wanted to break eye contact and stop being the center of whatever crisis he'd apparently triggered just by existing. But looking away from royalty during formal audience seemed like exactly the kind of thing that would make this situation worse. So he stayed locked in place, meeting those swirling galaxy eyes, and trying to project calm he absolutely didn't feel. The strange certainty in his chest had intensified into something that felt almost like recognition, which made no sense. Marcus had never been to the Caliph homeworld before, had never met Empress Saren, had no connection to the Caliph Empire beyond the basic diplomatic relationship between their civilization and humanities. There was no reason for this feeling, no reason for the Empress's reaction, no reason for any of this. But the feeling insisted otherwise, and Empress Saren's expression suggested she felt exactly the same impossible certainty. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical presence in the chamber, oppressive and expectant. Then Empress Saren stood. The movement triggered another wave of reaction through the assembled delegates, audible gasps, sharp intakes of breath, the rustle of formal attire as beings shifted position. Apparently this wasn't normal protocol. The Empress's chief advisor, an elderly caliph whose ears were nearly white with age, and whose formal robes were so elaborate they probably required engineering support, moved to her side immediately, speaking in low, urgent Caliph. She didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes remained fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made his skin prickle, like being examined by equipment designed to see through flesh and bone into whatever made someone fundamentally them. "You," she said, and her voice carried across the chamber with perfect clarity despite not being particularly loud. She was speaking standard, which was interesting. The translation matrix should have been handling language automatically. "Step forward." Marcus's brain short-circuited briefly. Step forward where? How far? The dais. The throne itself. Just a few steps. He glanced desperately toward the Terran delegation's senior observer, a woman named Quan who was standing in the gallery section reserved for non-primary attendees. She made a subtle gesture with one hand that he interpreted as, "Do what she says and try not to die." Helpful. Marcus walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the silent chamber, and stopped at the base of the dais because climbing the 47 steps without explicit permission seemed like an excellent way to get shot by the increasingly nervous-looking guards. Up close, the Empress's reaction was even more visible. She was trembling, not dramatically, but enough to notice. Her ears cycled through positions too rapidly for Marcus's cultural database to track. Shock, fear, recognition, wonder, confusion, all bleeding into each other in a pattern that suggested her emotional state was too complex for simple categorization. "Your name," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. More like a demand for confirmation of something she already suspected. "Lieutenant Marcus Way, Your Majesty, Terran Diplomatic Corps. I'm temporarily representing humanity in Ambassador Carrington's absence." His voice came out steadier than he felt, which was progress. Marcus Way, she repeated, testing the sounds like they might reveal hidden meaning. And before your military service, your lineage, your genetic inheritance. This was getting increasingly strange. Marcus glanced around the chamber, wondering if anyone else found this line of questioning weird, but the other delegates were watching with the kind of fascination usually reserved for accidents or disasters, awful but impossible to look away from. I'm from Earth, Your Majesty, North American sector originally. My family's not particularly notable, teachers, engineers, one uncle who ran a restaurant. Standard human lineage as far as I know. The Empress descended 3 steps, closing the distance between them until she was close enough that Marcus could see the swirling patterns in her eyes shift and change like weather systems on a living planet. You feel it, she said quietly, but in the dead silent chamber her words carried to every corner. The resonance, the echo, you must feel it. Marcus did feel something. That strange sensation that had started before entering the chamber and intensified with every passing moment. Like recognition without memory, certainty without knowledge, familiarity with someone he'd never met. But admitting that seemed like opening a door to complications he couldn't begin to understand. I'm not sure what I'm feeling, Your Majesty, he said honestly, because lying to someone who was clearly sensing something seemed counterproductive. The Empress reached out one hand, stopped halfway, clearly struggling with some internal debate. Her advisor said something sharp in Caliph, probably warning her not to touch the unknown alien. But she ignored him with the kind of casual dismissal that suggested 3 centuries of ruling, meant she didn't have to listen to advice she disagreed with. 347 years ago, she said, and her voice took on the quality of someone reciting from memory carefully preserved. The imperial palace was destroyed by sabotage. Explosives placed by political rivals who wished to erase my bloodline and claim the throne through the chaos of succession crisis. Marcus listened, confused about where this was going but certain it was significant. I was the heir, the Empress continued. 20 solar cycles old, barely an adult by our standards. I was in the palace when the explosives detonated. The structure collapsed. Fire, smoke, debris, chaos. The security recording showed the building falling for approximately 4 minutes before complete structural failure. Her ears flattened again, but this time Marcus's database suggested the position meant remembering pain. The official records say I survived by miracle, she said. That I was found in the ruins 3 days later, injured but alive, protected by some fortunate configuration of fallen beams that created a pocket of survivable space. She paused, her galaxy eyes searching Marcus's face for something he didn't know how to show her. The forbidden archives, she continued, and her advisor made a sound like choking. The records kept by my personal security and sealed by imperial decree tell a different story. The chamber was so quiet Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, unnaturally loud in his ears. Those records say I was pulled from the rubble, the Empress said. Not by rescue teams who didn't arrive for hours. Not by security who were overwhelmed and scattered, by someone else. Someone whose presence felt like, she gestured at Marcus, like this, like impossible calm in the center of chaos, like certainty when everything was falling apart, like safety when death was certain. She took another step closer, now on the same level as Marcus, the height difference between their species obvious. She was nearly a head taller. The being who saved me asked for nothing, she said softly. Expected nothing, pulled me free, ensured I could breathe, and vanished before I could see their face or understand who they were. I was in shock, injured, barely conscious. By the time I recovered enough to ask questions, they were gone. No trace. No record, no explanation. Her hand completed the gesture she'd started, resting lightly on Marcus's shoulder. The touch sent a jolt through his system, not painful, but intense, like completing a circuit that had been incomplete his entire life without him knowing it was missing a connection. I have spent 3 centuries wondering, the Empress said, who saved me, why they helped, what motivated someone to risk everything for a stranger. My people dismissed it as myth, said I must have imagined it in my traumatized state, suggested it was metaphor or prophetic symbolism. Her expression shifted into something that might have been wonder or grief or both. But I knew it was real, she said. I felt them, their presence, their emotional resonance, the way they felt calm and certain, and protective when everything else was terror and death. She looked at Marcus with an intensity that felt like being read in a language he didn't know existed. And now you stand before me, she said, and I feel it again. That same impossible calm, that same emotional signature, that same certainty of protection. Marcus's mouth had gone dry. Your Majesty, I wasn't alive 347 years ago. Humans live maybe 100 years if we're extremely lucky and have excellent medical care. I know, the Empress said, and her tone suggested this was exactly what confused and amazed her. Yet here you stand, carrying that same resonance. Not the same being, I understand that, but connected somehow. Linked across time in ways I do not understand. Her grip on his shoulder tightened slightly, not painful but unmistakably claiming him in front of 200 witnesses. Who are you, Marcus Way? She asked. What are you? And Marcus, standing in the throne room of an empire older than human civilization, had absolutely no answer to give her. The answer, when it came from an unexpected source. A caliph in the gallery section stood abruptly, his ears perked so far forward they looked like they might detach from his head. He wore the robes of a scholar, simpler than the formal court attire, but marked with symbols that suggested academic rank. He spoke in rapid caliph, his words tumbling over each other with urgency. The Empress's translator picked it up automatically, rendering his words in standard for the benefit of the multilingual assembly. Your Majesty, the Terran genetic research, the neural imprinting studies published in their scientific journals 3 years ago. Every being in the chamber turned to look at him. The scholar seemed to realize he just interrupted a royal audience and was now the absolute center of attention, but to his credit, he didn't back down. His ears shifted into what Marcus's database suggested was academically excited despite social terror. Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, he said, switching to standard and speaking directly to the assembly. But I believe I may have an explanation for what you're experiencing. Empress Sarin released Marcus's shoulder and turned to face the scholar fully. Speak. Humans, the scholar said, pulling up a holographic display from his wrist device, have a unique neurological phenomenon that we documented in their research literature. They call it generational echo memory, or sometimes genetic emotional imprinting. The display showed what looked like neural pathway diagrams, genetic sequences, brain imaging that Marcus couldn't interpret, but that clearly meant something to the assembled scientists and researchers. Most species process memory individually, the scholar continued, warming to his topic in the way academics did when they got to explain their specialty. Each generation starts fresh, neurologically speaking. We inherit genetic information, physical traits, predispositions, but not experiences. Memories die with the individual. He gestured at the neural pathways, highlighting certain connections. Humans are different. Their research shows that particularly profound experiences, moments of extreme emotion, significant trauma, or exceptional circumstances, can create imprints in their genetic code. Not complete memories, but fragments. Emotional echoes, resonance patterns that persist across generations. You're suggesting, Empress Sarin said slowly, that Lieutenant Wei carries memory, emotional memory, from an ancestor who was present during the palace destruction. It would explain what Your Majesty is experiencing, the scholar said. If Lieutenant Wei's ancestor was the being who saved you, if that event was profound enough to create an imprint, then he might carry fragments of that experience without any conscious awareness of it. He pulled up more data, genetic analysis that looked incredibly complex. The emotional signature, the sense of recognition, the resonance your majesty describes, these would persist across generations even if specific factual memories did not. Lieutenant Wei wouldn't remember saving you, but part of him, the deepest part, the genetic inheritance, would carry the emotional truth of that moment. The chamber erupted in whispers. Delegates leaning toward each other, scholars accessing their own research databases, the Terran observer Quan frantically messaging someone, probably Earth, probably demanding to know why nobody mentioned that humans were walking repositories of ancestral trauma. Marcus felt like his brain was trying to process too much information at once and threatening to shut down in protest. "Your Majesty," he managed, "I genuinely don't remember any palace explosion. I don't have memories that aren't my own. I'm just me." "But you feel it," the Empress insisted, and it wasn't quite a question. "The connection, the resonance, don't you?" Marcus considered denying it. Considered claiming the strange certainty in his chest was just anxiety or confusion or perfectly normal reactions to overwhelming diplomatic situations. But lying seemed impossible when she was looking at him like that, when her eyes held 3 centuries of wondering and hoping and seeking answers. "I feel something," he admitted. "Since before I entered the chamber, like coming home to a place I've never been, like recognizing someone I've never met, like knowing I'm exactly where I need to be for reasons I can't explain and definitely can't justify." He ran one hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he couldn't suppress. "But I don't know what it means. My family, there are stories. My grandmother talked about ancestors who traveled, who were always helping people, who disappeared for years at a time and came back different. There was something about a great-great-great-grandfather who kept journals that were lost, who mentioned debts across the stars and obligations that transcend understanding." Marcus had never paid much attention to those stories. They'd seemed like the kind of family mythology every lineage accumulated, embellished tales of interesting ancestors, probably more fiction than fact. Now he wondered, could it really be possible? He asked, looking between the Empress and the scholar, "Could I carry pieces of someone else's heroism without knowing it?" "The research suggests yes," the scholar said, "particularly for events of extreme significance. Saving a life, especially under such dramatic circumstances, would absolutely qualify as imprint-worthy." Empress Saren had gone very still again, but this time it was different. Not shock, but contemplation, calculation, decision-forming. "Marcus Way," she said formally, her voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of authority, "if what Scholar Thendris suggests is true, if you carry within you even a fragment of the being who saved my life and secured the continuity of my bloodline, then you are not merely a diplomatic observer. You are not simply a replacement delegate." She turned to address the full assembly, her posture shifting into something that screamed significance. "You are a bridge," she said, "across time, across species. Between the moment my fate was saved and this moment where our peoples stand together. Your ancestor, whoever they were, whatever motivated them, risked everything to protect someone they didn't know, for no benefit, expecting no reward." Her ears swept up into a position that Marcus's database finally identified. Profound recognition and honor. "That debt is acknowledged," the Empress declared. "That connection is honored. And the being who carries even a fragment of that selfless courage will be recognized accordingly." She gestured, and one of her advisors, looking like this was absolutely not in the planned ceremony but following orders anyway, produced a medallion that looked ancient and significant, made from metal that might have been gold but shifted through colors like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. "Marcus Way of Earth," Empress Saren said, and her voice resonated with ceremonial power. "You are hereby recognized as Friend of the Empire, a title held by only 3 beings in current existence, a bond that grants you voice in our councils, protection under our law, and access to our resources as though you were Caliph yourself." Marcus opened his mouth, probably to protest, or ask questions, or generally express that this seemed like a massive overreaction to his ancestor, maybe, possibly saving her life 3 centuries ago. But the Empress raised one hand in a gesture that clearly meant, "This is happening whether you like it or not, so save your breath." The advisor approached with the medallion, and before Marcus could fully process what was occurring, he was being awarded one of the highest honors the Caliph Empire could bestow. The other delegates were reacting with varying levels of shock, interest, and political calculation. The Terran observer Quan looked like she was having a religious experience, probably already composing the report to Earth about how their logistics officer accidentally became cosmically significant. "This will change everything," one of the Valorian delegates muttered, loud enough for Marcus's translator to catch. "The balance of power, the alliance structures, the trade negotiations, all of it shifts if humans carry the Empress's favor." He wasn't wrong. The ceremony continued, but Marcus was no longer standing in the margins observing. He was beside the throne itself, wearing a medallion that marked him as friend of the Empire, trying to process being catapulted from random replacement delegate to politically crucial bridge between civilizations in approximately 15 minutes. Empress Sarin caught his eye and for the first time since he'd entered the chamber smiled. It was a genuine expression, warm and relieved, like she'd been carrying a question for 300 years and finally, had an answer that felt right. "I know you did not ask for this significance," she said quietly, pitched for his ears alone while the ceremony proceeded around them. "I know you are confused and overwhelmed and probably wish you were anywhere else doing anything else. That about covers it, Your Majesty. But whether you asked for it or not, whether you remember it or not, part of you saved my life once. Part of you chose to help when you could have ignored the crisis and protected yourself. Part of you is the reason I am here, the reason my bloodline continued, the reason this empire exists as it does today." She touched the medallion now hanging around his neck, a weight that felt both physical and symbolic. "And part of me has been waiting 347 years to say thank you," she said. "Even if the being I'm thanking is separated from the original act by generations of inheritance and genetic distance, even if you carry only echoes of that moment rather than memories, I say it now. Thank you for my life, thank you for my future, thank you for choosing to help when helping was hard." Marcus felt something in his chest, that strange certainty that had been building since he entered the chamber, finally click into place like a puzzle piece, finding its proper position. He didn't remember saving her. Couldn't remember because it hadn't been him in any literal sense. But something deeper than memory, something written into his genetic code by an ancestor whose name he didn't know and whose face he'd never seen, recognized this moment as completion. Debt acknowledged, connection honored, circle closed. "You're welcome, Your Majesty," Marcus heard himself say, and meant it despite not understanding why, despite the impossibility of thanking someone for something you didn't do. The Empress nodded, satisfied, and returned her attention to the ceremony. Marcus stood beside the throne, wearing a medallion that marked him as friend of the Empire, carrying echoes of heroism he'd inherited without asking, and tried to accept that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to predict. The Terran observer Quan had finally stopped frantically messaging, and was just staring at him with an expression that combined pride, terror, and, "You better have a damn good explanation for this later." The other delegates had recalibrated their entire approach to the human presence. What had been polite, but dismissive was now intensely interested. And Empress Sarin, who had ruled for 3 centuries and seen empires rise and fall, treated the human lieutenant beside her not as an observer or a guest, but as someone who had already changed her fate once before and might do so again. The galaxy was watching. Politics were shifting. Alliances were forming that hadn't existed an hour ago. And Marcus, who had entered the chamber hoping to stand quietly and not screw up, had become the bridge between past survival and future cooperation, a living connection across time that made destiny out of coincidence and significance out of genetic inheritance. Some days, he reflected, you wake up as a logistics officer. Some days you end up carrying your ancestors' heroism into a new century. And some days, like today, you discover that the universe has plans for you that have been written in your genes since before you were born, just waiting for the right moment to unfold. The ceremony concluded. The delegates dispersed, and Marcus stood in the throne room of an empire older than human spaceflight, wearing a medallion that changed everything, and wondered what his great-great-great-grandfather would think about the ripples one act of courage had sent across centuries. Probably Marcus thought they'd be satisfied. Debts across the stars, obligations that transcend understanding, echoes that persist through generations. His ancestor had saved a life. Marcus was living in the future that choice had made possible, and somehow, impossibly, that felt exactly right.